of the Reader's Digest, India edition, and someone who I met accidentally during the pandemic at Saligaon in Goa, and someone whose story I've been keen to follow up on. And Ashok has been generous to share some of his insights into the Reader's Digest, India edition, of course. And the Reader's Digest itself, RD, completes 100 years this month, exactly 100 years. Give us some insights, Ashok, please, into your high points. We'll start off with your high points and then we'll go into the backstory. But we'll start off with your high points in RD.
Well, I guess the highest point was when I became the editor, and I was only 32 at the time.
Wow,
Uh, and that was, I mean, nothing to do with me actually. It was that that editor who was there before me, Rahul Singh, he quit to join the Indian Express uh, and become an editor of the Bombay edition. So that left a vacancy, and he recommended me. So I became the editor. And it was a very young age, actually, to become an editor. But interestingly enough, I wasn't too sure I wanted to be the editor. I'm basically, or at least I think of myself basically as a writer. And before that, I had been a writer for the Digest. So I wanted to actually continue that. But then everyone told me, I mean, you shouldn't refuse such a job. uh, it'd be silly of you to refuse a job, and being an editor uh, is sort of gets you more
prestigious,
money and is more prestigious,
prestigious.
etc. And you can also do some writing on the side for the Digest. So that convinced me to accept the job, and I stayed at it for, my God, I stayed from 1984 to 2006, which I
Wow,
believe is 32 years or something close to that. And I stayed at it for that long, largely because, uh, I needed the money because my children were being educated in the US. And even though they both got good scholarships, I had to bring them back and uh, during the holidays and so on. And the Indian Readers Digest didn't really pay all that well. uh, or rather, it did pay more than enough to uh, allow me to bring them back for their holidays. And so, as soon as I have two daughters, as soon as my second daughter finished college in the US, I quit. and then,
but sorry, sorry.
and, and then actually, then became demoted myself to being a writer again.
Wow. But of course, Reader's Digest played an influential role in our growing up, and it was one of the magazines which I think almost every middle class English speaking, English studying Indian read at that stage.
Absolutely, there was hardly any competition actually, and there was no. For many years, there was no television either, or at least there was just Doordarshan, one channel, and there weren't that many magazines, uh, and so the distractions or the alternatives rather were not that many. And this was an unusual magazine in the sense that it appealed to middle class people everywhere. I mean, not just in India, but everywhere, from the US to Egypt to any country that you can think of. It uh, it uh, it spoke to the aspiring middle classes who wanted to do better in life, not just financially, but in every way, to be better people, to be more have better relationships. So it offered advice on a wide variety of subjects. Of course, it also educated people to some extent by having quizzes like it pays to enrich your word power and so on. But uh, its main attraction, I think, was that it gave people a sense of well-being and a sense that people can achieve things no matter how humble they are. For instance, we use at that time, at least, we didn't carry many articles on celebrities. We wrote about ordinary people who had done unusual kind of things, like running an NGO extremely successfully, or facing some personal danger very successfully, or facing a personal crisis in some other form successfully. So it gave people the feeling that, yes, I can do it too. Even if I'm in trouble, no matter what kind of trouble, I can do it too. And it also gave people hope because when we wrote about a problem, we didn't just describe the problem. We found a person who had done something about the problem and done something successfully about that problem.
Like for example,
Well, one example that comes to mind is cheating in exams at university. Uh, while I was based in Delhi, I read in the paper that Meerut University, which is not, I mean, Meerut is not very far from Delhi, had a huge cheating scandal in which students openly copied their answers from books. In fact, they even got people who knew the answers and they sat together and wrote the answers down. And in one case, there were three people at the desk. And when someone asked, why are there three people? The third one said, my handwriting is good. And so we read all this happening in the newspaper because newspapers in Delhi because it was very well covered. And but none of the papers uh, really told you the background to what was happening. And actually, what had happened was that a professor at Meerut University, who was fed up of all this copying going on, decided to do something about it. So when the exam started and all the copying began, he went to Delhi and told the editors of all the newspapers, look, just very close by, there's this huge whole scale copying going on at Meerut University. Why don't you send your reporters there to cover it? And luckily, it was not a time when anything else, very much else was happening. So all the papers sent their reporters there and covered it extensively. And it created an uproar, because this was Delhi, all the Delhi papers were reporting it. The government got upset. Uh, the UGC got very upset, and they, called the chancellor, vice chancellor of the Meerut University, and told him, "You better cancel all the exams. This is farcical. What's going on?" Mind you, this had been going on every year. This was nothing new, but this was the first time that one of the faculty at uh, in the university, he was actually a professor of political science at Meerut College, a man called Kailash Gupta, extraordinary man, really extraordinary. Uh, he decided that he would try and stop it. So he planned it very
wow,
well. He got
wow,
the coverage,
yeah,
got people upset, and the exam was cancelled. And then some months later, the exams were held again. But so much pressure had been brought to bear on the UP government that they sent cops to every exam center and made
wow.
sure that there was no cheating.
So the news formula of Reader's Digest was very different from other contemporaries of its time, we could say.
Yeah, in one sense, in the sense that it did cover problems, but it covered them very differently. And it covered them in a way that people who read it would feel, hey, maybe I can do something like this too. And in fact, I did get several letters from professors at other universities who also faced the same problem and asked me to send them the address of Professor Gupta so
Wow.
that they could talk to him and find out how he managed the whole thing. And
Building a
this is
sense of hope,
funny.
building a sense of hope in that sense. Not
Exactly,
hopelessness.
yeah.
Not
and
hopelessness.
and to feel that, hey, something can be done, even in the most seemingly intractable kind of situations, something is possible. And of course this was a social problem, but when you read about people who faced cancer, say, very bravely. Now, it didn't mean that it didn't require the person to overcome cancer necessarily. The point was to face it bravely. And even if the person, say, in a case of cancer, passed away, the main lesson to take from an article on him or her would be, you must face things bravely. Don't sort of give in, just give in and mope. Try and do your best. And we had several articles in which people fought their diseases and were successful. But we didn't want to suggest that you couldn't, you would always win. That wasn't the message of the Reader's Digest, which seems to be the message today. You're all, we must win, we must be on top, we must be this, we must come first, etc. It just said that you have to do your best, and don't give in, don't give up. Do your best, no matter who you are, and no matter how, even if you're not very highly intelligent or highly skilled or whatever, there's a lot in you that can be used to tackle whatever problems there are. And I think that's a very sensible and sort of hopeful attitude. And I think that was one of the main secrets why the Digest was so phenomenally successful. I mean, it was by far the most widely read magazine in history, the most successful publishing venture in history, I think.
Which might be time to discuss what was its foundings and how it came about exactly 100 years back this month.
Yeah, it was started by a couple, an American couple. Uh, Basically, what had happened was there was this gentleman called DeWitt Wallace, and he had fought in the First World War, and I think he had been injured as well. And but he was the kind of man who loved to read a wide variety of magazines. He used to read a wide variety of magazines, and when he was in hospital, also he did a lot of reading. Now, and he felt that uh, a lot of these articles in these magazines were too long, and they gave too much unnecessary detail, but they could be condensed, and it would the condensation would be just as effective as the original article. If not, actually, it might even be more effective because it was easier to read, it would be quicker to read, etc. So he decided that he had a good idea, and he went to some publishers in America and said, why don't you bring out a magazine like this with articles that are condensed from other magazines? And everyone thought that it didn't make any sense, so they all turned him down. And then he and his wife decided to start exactly such a magazine, and in a basement in New York City they started this magazine. The first issue, I think, had about 5,000 copies,
Wow.
and which is very small by American
I see. I
standards.
see. I see.
And they didn't expect it to get very much larger. But to their astonishment, month after month, the number of subscribers zoomed. It took off exponentially, and it was almost way beyond their expectations. And they ended up among the richest couples in America.
Wow.
Uh,
All stories start that way. I mean, at least the success stories, when you look back at them, they start in some basement, including Lonely Planet, which was sold for a few $100 million and things like that.
right,
But
yeah,
but
many
it's
of them are.
interesting. It's interesting. It's interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, so and of course, apart from the quality of the articles, an extremely good condenser. You know, he really could get to the heart of an article and cut out all the unnecessary fluff, or at least
Wow.
what he thought was the unnecessary fluff.
Wow. Which is a
And
skill. Which is a skill in itself, in that sense.
yeah, I mean, he was very skilled. I think in many ways, not only was he a very great businessman, he was also a very skilled journalist.
Wow.
And what later happened, initially the magazine started as being just a compilation of articles from other publications. And then Mr. Wallace had an idea. He found that a lot of magazines were not bringing out as many good articles as he would like. So he did something quite unusual. He commissioned people to write articles. Then he would take and go and show it to an editor of another magazine and say, "Look, I'll give this magazine to you. I mean, I'll give you this article for free. All you have to do is allow me to condense it and publish it in my magazine and say that it was condensed from your magazine." Uh, so, what editor would refuse such something like that when he was getting an excellent article
Right.
for free? So, gradually, you know, started writing its own articles, initially disguised as condensations from other magazines, and then it decided to have original articles and treat it as commissioned by the Digest. And because the magazine was so successful and so financially successful, Mr. Wallace
Oops. I think. Sorry. 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 Yeah. Sorry. Sorry.
so Mr. Wallace used to say to writers, take your time, spend as much money as you want, but I want a first rate article which tells you exactly, or which explores the subject that you're writing on and is crisply written. Now, which writer could, this was a dream of any writer. Take your time, spend as much money as you want,
Wow.
travel, etc. And so a lot of very good writers were attracted to the magazine, and he paid them very well as well. So he got a
He had the
lot.
numbers. He had the numbers, and he could afford to pay them. No, probably at that in those.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, this was because the magazine was so successful. And there is one story about some disaster had taken place in an island, and the entire press had rushed there. And Mr. Wallace told a reporter, "Look, why don't you go there and cover it for the Reader's Digest?" And the writer got to somewhere near there, and he said, "Look, there are no taxis available. There's no transport that I can take there. No public transport whatsoever." So Mr. Wallace said, "Buy a car and go."
Is it true or apocryphal?
Yeah, it is true. It is true. It's
I
not.
see. I see.
Yeah, these are the
Wow.
kind of things that make working for the Digest legendary. And also he also was able to zero in on what people really wanted to read. So there was a story about he had lunches at his in his office where he invited all kinds of top people from all over the world. I mean, all over the United States. And at one lunch, apparently there were four-star generals and ambassadors and all top people there. And then the talk was mostly about global strategy and all kinds of elevated stuff like that. And then suddenly Mr. Wallace asked one of the writers, "Hey, is it true that in Japan babies don't cry?" And everyone was stunned. What is this guy asking about babies in Japan not crying? So the writer who was addressed said, "Well, I don't really know, but I've heard that there's something in that. There's something about the babies and Japanese babies not crying." So Mr. Wallace told him, "Look, why don't you go to Japan and find out? and write a story about it. And it was the kind of story that people liked
I see.
because it was close to their hearts. All this, for instance, I haven't been able to read all the articles on the latest budget, and frankly, you read them, I wouldn't be able to understand them. Most
Right.
people are like me. We just, we don't know much about high finance and so on. But if we are told, hey, you know, how can you teach your child to be a little more studious? We'll all jump at it, and we'll want to know. So he
There
had
was
that.
there was a very strong Ashok. There was a very strong human element in all the pieces. There was a
Exactly.
element of drama. There was a element of it could happen to anyone. There was an element
Exactly.
of humor. There was a element of language teaching, which as aspiring Indians wanting to improve their English would also look at. So
Yeah.
that was the masala of the global edition. But when it came to India, how did the priorities change? Did you all reprint a lot from overseas? Did you all produce increasingly more content yourselves, or what?
Yeah, initially we were just printing articles that were sent to us, and mind you, it wasn't just the U.S. edition. There were so many editions, and all of them sent articles into a common pool, and that bunch of articles was sent to every editor,
In all
and
languages. In all languages.
no, it was all. I mean, it depended on it. No, actually, it was sent in English
I see.
to every editor, even if he was in Spain or Scandinavia or wherever. It was sent in English, and then if it was a non-English speaking country, he used to have excellent translators who could translate the English into the local language. Of course, in India we had no problems because our magazine was in English. So we used to get this whole bunch, maybe 30, 40 articles a month, and we would choose which ones were most likely to be appreciated by our readers and enjoyed by our readers. And then gradually we started publishing Indian articles. And we never got to more than, say, 20% or 25%. Uh, but, but because we also realized that people wanted to read foreign articles too. I mean, they wanted to get a sense that the digest was a window to the world, what other
Mm.
people were thinking in other countries. So it never became uh, deliberately an entirely an Indian magazine. Uh, and also, writing for the digest is not at all easy. It requires a lot of research. It requires you to write very simply and vividly. It requires you to give examples, anecdotes, and follow
The
through.
fact checking was legendary. Tell us about the fact checking.
Yeah, we were. That was one of the things that were insisted on. That we had to tell only the truth. We couldn't make up facts. We couldn't make up anything.
Couldn't make up
So
quotes. Couldn't make up quotes like many
nothing,
journalists do.
nothing. Yeah, nothing we could. Well, in a sense, I think let me explain that a little bit. It's not exactly true, uh, but we had a department called the fact checking department. It's called the research department, actually. And we had a person there whose duty was to check and verify all the facts in a story. Now, so they would go back to the sources, the people who were quoted in the article, and ask them, did this happen to you? Did you say this? Now, occasionally a writer might uh, invent a quote, or rather put, write a was more colorful than what the person actually said, or more precise and more,
Or
more to
maybe
the point.
just misunderstood what the person meant or something like that. Yeah, it happens without malice also.
No, no, no. The
Okay.
person understood. The writer understood what the person was saying,
Okay.
but his source may have expressed it rather clumsily. So he put it in better language. Let's say that. But then the researcher would ask the source after the article was written and before it was published, Did you say this? And the source would say, yes, I said it. Because actually, he may not have used those exact words, but that was what he meant.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, we stretch things a little bit, but it was not inaccurate.
Right.
It was never untruthful. Uh, and I remember many occasions in which it took longer to verify the facts than it took the writer to write the article, because sources were missing for some time. They'd gone somewhere else. All kinds of things were possible, and I remember we ran a story on a train that fell into a river in Kerala, and
79 or 81 or something, I remember in my school days.
yeah, something I forget the exact
Yeah,
year.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so I asked someone to go there and cover the story, which he duly did. And then I asked someone, actually Mohan Shivanand, who succeeded me as the editor. At that time, uh, he was just a sort of a member of the staff. But to check all this, we needed a person who knew Malayalam, and Mohan is a Malayali. So I told him, you go and check, uh, the facts, verify the facts, make sure that they're all true. So I think Mohan took, he had to hunt down all these people and ask them whether they had said this and whether they had done that, etc. And I remember it took quite some time, but he did it, and all the facts. And when we published it, everything was absolutely correct, and we got letters from people who'd been involved saying, "Wow, this was a great story, and it's absolutely true. Everything that you said happened." So this was one of the Digest's great strengths, that it wanted people to trust the magazine. There was none of this nonsense about thinking that, oh, maybe this writer has stretched the facts, and he's he's doing something that's not really truthful. You could be sure that if it appeared in the digest, it happened, and it was true.
One question that always comes up was, the Reader's Digest also had its own ideological tilt, in the sense during Cold War times it was very anti Soviet, anti,
Right.
left wing kind of thinking. Where did that come from? The founder, or
Yeah, that was the founder. That was the American, middle class
Hmm,
is very anti-Russian. It's for freedom and so on. And
right?
Russia was seen as this monolithic, dangerous kind of place that was, a rival to America. So they used to run a lot of anti-Russian, anti-communist articles,
Yeah,
and we did run some of them because the Indian middle class was not really very communist, was not inclined to be communist.
but the political discourse was in those years left wing, at least, no, in that sense, Soviet
Yeah,
meaning
but
left wing.
but this was not. But you'd be
Yeah,
surprised. I once got a letter from a Naxalite who was serving a prison term. I forget where, maybe in Bengal or somewhere.
okay,
He said, "Can you please send me copies of the Reader's Rights? I love reading the magazine." And I was really tickled
I
by
see,
the fact that here
I
was
see.
this guy who stood for everything politically that the Digest didn't stand for, but
Right,
still wanted to read the magazine because of the other kind of articles,
right.
that he enjoyed. So of course we sent him we sent him copies of the magazine. But at times I didn't run all the articles. I mean,
Yeah,
all the anti-Soviet articles. I ran some of them, and I remember on one occasion when the American Digest uh, carried an anti-Castro article,
I see.
and I didn't run it because, of course,
He was
Castro.
a hero. He was a hero in the third world then, at least.
Yeah, and India and Cuba had very good ties, so I didn't run it. And I must say that I was pulled up for it.
I see.
Uh, the Americans asked me, why didn't you run this article? It was a great article. And I said, well, India and Cuba are good friends. So I didn't want to offend Indians. and I didn't want to offend our government also.
Right.
Uh, so they said, "Oh yeah, okay," but so they're not very happy with me
Okay.
as far as that was concerned. But they had a very clear idea, very precise idea of what readers wanted. For instance, we had a I saw an article on Amitabh Bachchan in one of the papers. I think it was either Bombay Magazine or some magazine. And since Amitabh Bachchan, was the top star of the time, I thought, hey, maybe we should condense this article and run it in our magazine. And in those days, we had to send what we were publishing to the Americans before, and they had to give their okay. This was very early on, after I became editor. So I sent the condensed piece to America, and they came back and said, why are you running this piece? What's so great about this guy? He's just a great film. I mean, he's just a very popular film star. So what? So I said, look, you guys don't understand. He is the greatest Indian since Buddha. I mean, everyone loves him, and this is going to be lapped up. So they said, okay, I mean, you know your audience better than we do. And so I ran the article. And then, to my astonishment, I started getting criticism from all kinds of people. And I couldn't believe it. I said, what are these guys doing? Why are they criticizing a piece on Amitabh Bachchan?
I see.
So I spoke to a few people, and they said, of course, we love Amitabh Bachchan, but we don't want to see him in the Reader's Digest. What has he done? He's done nothing. If you want to write about a film star, write about someone like Sunil Dutt, who's done something, who's entered politics, and, you know, he's tried to do something for society. Write about a guy like that. Don't write about Amitabh Bachchan. He's done nothing. We don't want him in the digest. We'll wrap up. We want to read him in Stardust and, Filmfare, etc. We'll wrap up stories about him in those magazines, but we don't want to see him in Reader's Digest.
That's also like you're giving your readers a culture shock by seeing the wrong things in the wrong place.
Right. And
On the
the point about it was that I didn't understand my audience as well as the Americans understood my audience.
right, it's always a dicey matter. But who was your competition, Ashok, in those days in terms of magazines? There were few, no? There were only very few.
There was the Illustrated Weekly, of course, which was very good under Kushwant Singh.
Yeah,
Then India Today came in, but that was a more political magazine. There were a few general interest magazines, but just a handful.
Sunday, maybe Onlooker. These were small, but
Yeah, but they were all basically
news,
political, news and
political news.
political. You know, I mean, it is the main thrust of those magazines was news and politics.
Today,
While
there's a
we,
lot. Sorry.
yeah, but we didn't go in for news. And another interesting thing is, talking about, say, a disaster. Everyone goes, all the reporters go and cover a disaster, say, and write about it immediately. But what we did was we would send someone to cover the disaster and then wait for a while and then find out what happened in the aftermath, etc. And spend a lot of time in thoroughly researching what happened. And then publish the article, say, maybe 4 or 5 months after the disaster. And you would think that, hey, what do you mean publishing an article about a disaster 5 months after it has happened? Who would be interested? But we would write it in such a way that everyone would be interested. We would bring out the human side of it, as you rightly said earlier, which which the newspapers did not because they didn't really have the time to do it. We could research something really thoroughly and
So,
tell.
so speed was not the main thing in that sense. It
That's
was
right.
not
Yeah,
just mindless speed and
yeah.
mindless reporting.
As I told you, Mr. Wallace told writers, take your time. Take your time to produce a really good piece. That's what I want. I'm not interested in fast journalism.
That's a
I want
fascinating
something that
perspective. That's a
lasts.
fascinating perspective in those times more so.
I'm sorry, what?
That's a very fascinating perspective more
Yeah,
so in those
exactly. Yeah,
times.
yeah.
But today, Ashok, with all this featureization of news and a lot of competition, do you anticipate that had you been at the helm of Reader's Digest today, you would have had a different ball game to deal with?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. Of course, there's so much competition today that it'd be very difficult for the digest to maintain such a high circulation. And I'm not sure what the circulation now is, but I would believe that it's gone down somewhat. It must have,
Right,
because
right.
people have television, the internet. They have all kinds of other alternatives to spend their time.
And of course, the way they got the circulation was interesting and also controversial. They kept pushing the ads and the prizes and the competitions at you. What's your take on that? I don't know if it
That's right.
was there in
Yeah,
your time.
it was. I mean, not only did they have very good writers, they had very good marketing people as well, who came up with very many creative ideas, marketing ideas. And I must confess that the success of the digest was not entirely due to the quality of the writing, but it was also had a lot to do with the very good marketing techniques that people used. And some of them went against the grain, actually. For instance, we used to write
They're all
fairly.
part. Everything is fair in love, war, and circulation, I guess.
Yeah. And but to give you an interesting example, we used to we had far more subscriptions than newsstand copies. The and and of course the subscription copies were priced at half the cost of the newsstand copy.
Right.
So the newsstand circulation was, it was very high. It was higher than most magazines.
How much, if you don't mind me asking, in
Well,
those
I don't know.
days?
It may have been at least 40, 50,000, sixty
Wow,
thousand at
wow.
one time, which
Which was a huge number for in
for
English magazine in
any other
India.
magazine, right?
Right.
Uh, but uh, and some of the marketing techniques were interesting in the sense that we used to write very long letters to potential subscribers and talk about all kinds of things. And then at one point, close to when I was leaving the magazine, it was felt by the marketing people in the digest itself, in the Indian digest, that we should call in an ad agency to spruce up our marketing techniques. And the marketing agency came in and looked at our copy, the letters we sent out, said, "Hey, this is far too long. No one reads these things. You've got to cut it drastically and shorten it so that people don't have enough time to read these days," and so on. So we tried it out for a little while, and in fact, the circulation dropped because people did want to read longer. If it was written by the marketing team of the Reader's Digest, they made it interesting even though it was long. And the marketing people here didn't understand that. They thought, that you've got to make it short and crisp, and that's what will sell. I mean, that was true of the
Yeah, carry on, carry on.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
true of the uh, articles themselves. They had to be short and crisp, but the sales techniques were somewhat different.
So just to shift gears and to talk about some of your writings in the magazine, tell us your favorite. And of course, one of the pieces which I still remembered very strongly, which you had written, was India with a Portuguese accent, Goa. And
Right.
actually, I bugged you to find it, and you did find it and share it with me very recently. Tell us about this piece and your memories of writing it.
Yeah, what had happened was uh, we had carried a piece by the well-known travel writers Hugh and Colleen Ganser. They had written an article on Pondicherry, and the title was Pondicherry, India with a French accent.
I see.
So then I thought to myself, why can't we do something on Goa and entitle it Goa, India with a Portuguese accent.
Right.
So I went to Goa, and I was very lucky. Uh, I knew a couple of rather well-known, influential people in Goa who belonged to the Menezes family, and
CMM, Cosme Matthias Menezes.
Cosme Matthias Menezes.
Right.
Uh, and so I told them, I went to Goa and I told them, look, I'm doing this article. And they said, fine, we'll introduce you to all the people you want to meet. And so, thanks to them, I had, all the sources opened up to me. And they invited me to their homes, this, that, talk freely to me, etc. And of course, I must confess, it was not an accurate picture of Goa. Uh, because by then, of course, you know, a lot of Portugal had disappeared from Goa. I mean, the main language was English. Uh, Not that many people spoke only in Portuguese and so on. So it was slanted somewhat to um to represent or give a picture of what was left of Portugal in Goa. So that was what I was concentrated on, and I must say I did receive some criticism from people who said this is not Goa. This is a very small part of Goa, small slice of Goa.
No, I wouldn't fault you for that, Ashok, because see, when we are trying to project a certain point, a certain aspect, we are not being in the media. We in the media, in the sense, are not being totally accurate and representing everything. We are representing just that aspect. So I remember in 1983, I think it was, or 1991, I think, when it was 30 years after liberation, I was looking around for signs of Portuguese still remaining, and what I found was, a post office in Anjuna with this Portuguese sign on the front entrance in big bold letters, and I actually photographed it. And barber shops in Panjim with Portuguese names, they are still around there. So
Yeah,
so I mean, yeah, we are searching for that aspect. But you wrote it in which year?
I think it must have been in the early '80s sometime,
I see.
or maybe mid. I think
Mid 80s, mid
maybe it was
80s,
mid to late '80s. I'm not sure.
mid 80s. It says here there is some date. No, November 1990, South Africa edition.
This is the Indian edition. I think carried it somewhat earlier,
Okay,
maybe a year or two earlier. And
okay,
this was an example of how the digest shared articles. So
I
I
see.
must have sent this to the American office, and they redistributed it to all the editions. And since Goa was such a popular place and well-known place, lots of editions carried it. So here
I
was
see.
the South African edition carrying it. And I couldn't find the article in the Indian edition, but I found this in the South African edition's article. And for instance, another similar piece I did was not similar, but a piece that was carried pretty much everywhere was, we have these palace on wheels trains
Right,
that are luxury trains that go from one place to another in a particular state, and then you get to see various cities in that state and various historical places in that state. So I went on one of the palace on wheels in the state of Rajasthan, which was, I think, the first. There are now other palace on wheels going to other states, but the Rajasthan one was the first and perhaps most popular, because Rajasthan is a very feudal kind of still a very feudal kind of society, and foreigners are attracted by all the maharajas and
right.
palaces and all that kind of stuff. So, and I did the story, and it was carried by everyone. Every edition carried it, because not because I had written it, or the article was exceptional in any way, but the subject was interesting to people. And then another example was my successor Mohan Shivanand suggested to me. I'd by then become a writer, and he suggested to me, "Why don't you write an article on Gandhiji's last day?"
Wow.
So it was a brilliant idea. And so I did a lot of research, read several books and so on, and reconstructed Gandhiji's last day.
Wow.
And it was picked up by everyone. Gandhiji, everyone, who hasn't heard of Gandhi anywhere in the world?
But the angle is unique. The angle of having is focusing on his last day and
Yeah.
maybe just
And
those 24 hours.
yeah, getting up in the morning at 3 o'clock, which is what he did, then prayer meetings, this, that, all kinds of things. And ending, of course, with him being assassinated.
Everyone knows where the story is going to end. That's sad.
Yeah, right. But the appeal of Gandhiji is so great.
Hmm.
I mean, he's revered all over the world. Unfortunately, not as much as he should be in India. Uh, that all the editions carried it. So here was an example. You see, it depends on the nature of the article. If it's something that people would identify with or like, it doesn't matter whether they are Africans or Scandinavians or Indians or Portuguese or whatever. People, the middle class everywhere is very similar in their yearnings,
Aspirations.
aspirations, their yearnings, what they want, what they like, etc. At least there are lots of similarities between them.
And the Reader's Digest proved it with its many editions. How many editions across the globe?
Gosh, I don't know. At least I think 30, 40 editions, something like that.
Wow.
But I mean, all the editions didn't last. After some, this happened after I had left. They'd been wanting to have a Chinese edition, given the huge market in China. So they started a Chinese edition, but I think after a few years they stopped because the Chinese government put too many restrictions on what they could write.
I see.
So they decided not to have a Chinese edition.
What's your advice, Ashok, for youngsters in the field today in terms of the kind of stories we should be doing? Our papers are heavily suffused with politics and a bit of sports. What's your advice? What are we missing? What are we overlooking? What are we lacking?
Well, one thing is, people Indians are do love sports. Indians are cricket crazy people, uh, but there's already a lot of that, and Indians are obsessed with politics as well. But they're interested in other things as well. And one of the things that a lot of people say to me is that so much of what we read is very depressing. You know, it's we are a country with huge problems, huge poverty levels, and all kinds of conflicts between religions, between communities, uh, between castes, and so on. So we want to, read something that's different. We want to feel. We don't want to feel terrible about India all the time. So one of the things one can do is to write about these problems. Of course, they're very important problems. I mean, you can't say that they're not important, but do it in such a way as to humanize it and to leave and really profile people instead of writing about it in the abstract in a very general kind of way. Personalize it. Find people who have done something about a particular issue and who've done some good work in many areas. And there are lots of them actually. Lots of
True,
Indians doing very good work.
true.
So write about them. That's one good. That's one thing. And the bonus you get from that is that you realize, you know, how many Indians there are who are doing very good work, but silently.
And how much is possible with so little resources at times?
Exactly. So many people are, managing to do remarkable things with very little money and very few resources. And how inventive they are, in tackling these problems. I'll give you just one example. Uh, I did a story on a couple who ran a health NGO in a small village in Maharashtra. And one of the things they did was to train village women as health workers. And one of the problems they faced was when they called these women to their establishment to train them, the women were very hesitant about mixing with other women of different castes. And they were not very comfortable sitting with a person from a different caste. So this doctor, his name was Raj Arole, he had come up with something that would break down this resistance. And he had several ways of doing it. One is that he would take a bit of blood from someone, put it put it on a slide, and tell these women, you go and look through that microscope, and can you tell me the caste of the person? And of course they couldn't. And things like this. Or he would open a cupboard, and there'd be a skeleton dangling in the cupboard, and you say, can you tell me the caste of that person who's died and whose skeleton is there? And of course they couldn't. And he used all these kind of inventive ways to break down caste barriers. I mean, it was really remarkable. And I met several of the women who told me how conservative and how hidebound they had been in their attitudes about caste, and how this guy had freed them. Now they're no longer worried about whom they were eating with or sitting with or chatting with. They realize that all people are the same. They're all equal. So,
What a fascinating story, and this is actually a story of all your stories. And just when I was listening to you, I think that I thought struck me. It made me think that Ashok has to write his book, and I'm not saying it because I'm a publisher, far from it. But you should write your book at some stage. I think all of us who have seen some form of news from the ringside view are kind of have an inside view into what happened, at least a close view, a closer view than most. And maybe you should tell your story there. And of course the other point is that we are caught up in this breathless form of journalism. We don't miss out on the slow moving stories, which are actually what is more important in life in the long run. Any last words or things that I've not asked you, which you would like to say or state,
well,
or any?
I'd just like to comment on your very kind request for me to write a book. I really feel that I've written my book, but it has appeared in different chapters
That's not good enough.
over
That's
the
not good enough.
years of the
That's
reader's
that's
life.
not good enough, Ashok. Merely because it's difficult to access it. When I wanted your piece on Goa, I had to hound you, and you had to hound I don't know whom to actually get that article which we were showing on the screen a little while back. So make it accessible. That's all my request. I know a lot of journalists have written their biographies. So even I was checking out Jag Suraya some time back when he came to release it in Goa, and we belong to that generation which also grew up with the junior statesman JS
Right,
in our
right.
younger days.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And when you know the inside story of a guy, like it's different. No, I may have read any number of Reader's Digest, but when I talk to you, it's different. So tell us what I didn't ask you.
Well, I'll try. I'll try. But actually, I'm now rather busy with another project, uh, and which is perhaps my most difficult project, which is to write a novel. All journalists are supposed to have some good stories in them, which they can tell in the form of fiction. And I'm attempting to write fiction and finding it quite difficult, actually.
It is difficult because we have to unlearn our styles and get into a new
Exactly.
skill.
Yeah. We've got to
And
imagine. We've got to invent.
yeah, we've got to invent when our whole life we've been told get your facts right, and for the first time we are told get your facts wrong, but make it
Right.
credible. But actually, I'm dead against fiction, and I tell guys, if you have a non-fiction story in you, go for it. Don't bother with the fiction, man. Anyway. But all the
Thank you
best,
very
and
much.
I'm not
Thank
trying to
you,
discourage you from that.
Rico. Thank
I'm
you,
not
Rico.
most welcome. It's a real pleasure talking to you. I learned so much, and I'm really grateful for you for taking this time and sharing your all your immense amount of experience and knowledge and insights with us. Thanks so much, Ashok.
Yeah,
We'll
it's
be
been
in
my
touch.
pleasure. Thank you.
We'll be in
Thanks a
touch.
lot.
Maybe meet up in Goa again when you get
Yes,
a
I'll be
chance.
coming there to
You're
visit my
most
daughter.
welcome. Most welcome. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.